Today, I'm going to tell you the story of a man who invested almost the entirety of his life savings in one single asset that promised him safety and a scorching hot 7% return. And this story about a man we'll call Mason will highlight something ominous that is happening to literally hundreds of thousands of people with very little news coverage for over a year and a half. And that is a major company holding customer funds and disallowing the withdrawal of those funds, even though the money rightfully belongs to its users. So let's start this story. Mason's predicament begins in July 2022, a time where cryptocurrency was not doing so great. Bitcoin had been on the decline for basically the entire year, along with the rest of the cryptocurrency market. With that said, Mason had actually invested in Bitcoin and Ethereum years earlier. He didn't invest a lot and he didn't make a lot of money, but it was enough for him to believe in the industry. Although Mason wasn't stupid, while he did believe, he did so with a grain of salt, and he understood that crypto was in the decline right now, a so-called crypto winter, which means that most of his liquid cash, which wasn't invested in his company 401k, sat in high-yield savings accounts. And that cash was almost 100 grand. And this, unfortunately, is where the story starts to unravel for Mason. Because in July of 2022, he saw an asset that offered a return that was just too juicy to pass up. And that asset promised safety and security on top of its virtually guaranteed 7% annual return. And while this asset in question was a crypto asset, it wasn't your standard risky coin. And it was backed by one of the largest companies in the industry. And on top of that, what made it seem safe for Mason was that it wasn't your standard risky coin that fluctuated a ton. It was more so a currency, a digital currency backed one-to-one by US dollars. For every one of these currencies that was created, a US dollar was kept in the company's bank account. This is almost unlike traditional banking, where most of your deposits are lent out to other people. And because of that, on the surface, for Mason, this seemed almost safer, and the return was much higher than he was currently getting in his high-yield savings account. And all he had to do was convert his US dollars to this virtual currency and let it sit on the well-trusted platform, all while earning a juicy 7% plus return. And given how safe the asset seemed, especially since it kept a 1-to-1 ratio of US dollars in the bank, and it was audited regularly by a third-party company to show this, given all of this, Mason felt comfortable depositing the entirety of his $100,000, which to him virtually guaranteed $7,000 a year of passive income. Unfortunately for Mason and for the hundreds of thousands of other users who are in this exact same predicament, all of that money invested and all of the percentage return generated are inaccessible and unwithdrawable to this day. And while on the app, for all of these users, the money says it's there, it might as well have not existed because it hasn't been usable or accessible for over a year and a half. And at this point, some of you may very well know what I'm talking about. And for those of you that don't, I'm talking about none other than Gemini Earn. Now, Mason has a shit end of the stick. Mason invested a huge portion of money, a sum that puts him in the upper percentage of investors on the platform. And perhaps you might even say that Mason should have done some research or spread his money between different investments. And those are valid points. But even for those who did that, even for those who only invested $1,000 or $3,000 or $5,000, is it right? Is it fair? And is it reputable for a company this large, for a company this well-funded and well put together as Gemini to do this to its users? And just to put into perspective how reputable this company was, Gemini was the first licensed digital asset exchange for individuals and institutions, licensed by the New York State Department of Financial Services. And if you scour the web during this 2022 period, you will see people, articles, and experts touting how safe Gemini is. And maybe that was the case, but there is one missing piece to this puzzle. And that is Genesis Digital. Now, in order to highlight what has happened over the last year and a half and what may happen in the future, I'm going to explain this timeline from the perspective of Mason, from the perspective of someone who has $100,000 sitting on the platform, who has $100,000 on the line. And this unfortunate timeline starts on November 16th, 2022. You see, up until that point, everything seemed like smooth sailing for Mason. While the cryptocurrency market was in turmoil and coin prices were falling left and right, for him, all he saw was a steady 7% upward trend in his money. Every month, his money grew while everyone else's shrank. And every night, he slept like a baby, knowing his money was safe on the Gemini platform, one of the most reputable companies in the industry. Well, all that changed on November 16th, 2022. And that's because that was the day Mason lost access to over $100,000 of principal and interest. That was the day, the beginning to a situation that has plagued Mason and hundreds of thousands of other users to this day. And that's because that was the day another company, Genesis Digital, paused withdrawals from its platform. And the problem? Well, Genesis Digital was Gemini's lending partner. And while Gemini did hold a 1-to-1 ratio of customer deposits, that was for the exchange portion of its business. The Earn program lended out money through institutional borrowers vetted by Gemini. And by doing so, it was able to offer returns over 100 times higher than the average American savings rate. And what's interesting is, if you dig into articles and news releases at the time by Gemini, you'll see things like this. Customers can transfer existing crypto holdings or easily purchase crypto to transfer into Gemini Earn and earn interest for any period of time. They can also redeem their crypto at any time. As a New York-based trust company with security protocols on par with those offered by top financial institutions, Gemini's secure custodies and exchange solutions also integrate seamlessly with Gemini Earn. These releases and articles convey heavy security and safety, and they make little to no mention of the process or of Genesis Digital. That is, of course, until November 16th, 2022. On November 16th, 2022, Genesis Global Capital, LLC, known as Genesis, the lending partner of the Earn program, paused withdrawals and messaged that they will not be able to meet customer redemptions within the service level agreement, SLA, of 5 business days. We are working with the Genesis team to help Earn users redeem their assets from the Earn program as quickly as possible. Well, for Mason, the promise of redeeming his over $100,000 of funds as quickly as possible has not happened. And it hasn't happened for over a year and a half. To this day, Mason's $100,000, along with over $900 million other dollars belonging to about 360,000 other Earn users, are inaccessible. Now, between that day, between November 16th, 2022 and today, what has happened? Well, for Mason, it feels like a whole lot of nothing. And I quote, "They haven't done anything. They've sued each other back and forth, and the SEC has sued them, and they say they're going through bankruptcy court, but they've so far done nothing to make users whole." And Mason went on to say, "I know Gemini easily has $900 million sitting in their accounts. They could have made users whole immediately and then fought with Genesis Digital in court on their own time, but instead, they've chosen to drag us all along for the ride." Now, what Mason is talking about is the countless of lawsuits and bankruptcy proceedings that have happened, all while he and the 360,000 other users can only sit and wait. Genesis has sued Gemini. Gemini has sued Genesis. And the SEC has charged both companies with the sale of unregistered securities. Genesis has agreed to pay a $21 million fine to the SEC, still with no money relinquished to its users. And all that has happened while Genesis has gone through bankruptcy proceedings. And while Gemini argues its $900 million claim on behalf of its users in bankruptcy court. This has gone on for over a year and a half, and I still haven't seen a penny, Mason says. Now, what does Gemini say? Well, actually, they say there's a glimmer of hope right around the corner. And that's because on February 28th of this year, and I quote from Gemini, "Today, we shared with EARN users that we have finally reached a settlement in principle with Genesis and other creditors in the Genesis bankruptcy that will, if approved by the bankruptcy court, result in all EARN users receiving 100% of their digital assets back in kind." Good news? Yes, if approved by the bankruptcy court, which might take place on April 16th, which is right around the corner. And if it's approved, Mason, along with the other 360,000 users, can expect 97% of their funds within the next 2 months, and then access to the remaining 3% within the next 12 months. Mason says that's fantastic, but what about all the interest? Or what about the opportunity cost of not having access to $100,000 of my money that I could have invested in other things for the last 18 months? I mean, he has a point. Gemini is a huge, supposedly very reputable company. There surely had to be a better way to handle all of this. Hey everyone, hope you enjoyed the video and I hope you found it informative. I just wanted to disclose that I myself have money sitting in Gemini Earn. Now, unlike Mason, I don't have life-changing money sitting in Gemini Earn. I've always diversified my money as much as possible. And while Gemini Earn seemed to imply that it was more so akin to a savings account, I read between the lines and I dug into the fine print. And I understood that it wasn't. It was more so an investment, and investments carry risk. And because of that, my exposure is no more than a couple $1,000s. So for me, this whole debacle has been more than anything interesting to see how it plays out. But I have a degree in finance. This stuff interests me, and I was taught about diversification and investment risk. For a huge portion of the 360,000 other users, that's not the case. For a huge portion of them, this was a trusted company offering a 7% return on what it touted as a very safe investment. And because of that, some people invested much more money, 10, 20, 30, or $100,000. Some people invested money that they needed with the assurance that they could withdraw it at any time. Our financial companies need to do better and be clearer about the risk involved with these types of things. Or else, more of our American brothers and sisters and our world brothers and sisters will surely end up in a similar position as Mason.